Welcome back. In this video, we will be starting a brand new section called State Management. Now, I've done state management before in videos or previous videos of mine. For example, we've looked at state list widgets versus state full widgets. And then as part of the state full widgets, there's a state object where we can actually set the state using the setState method or the setState function. So what is this section then about if I say this is state management now? So we will look at an example today and see why maybe using setState all of the time will not be 100% effective. In fact, most of the time, and I mean 99% of the time, you will not be using setState. So just hold on there, we will get to that example now. So if you go to flutter.dev/docs development, then on the left-hand side, you will see there's data and backend, state management, and you can go through the introduction, think declaratively, and so forth. And at the end, we will stand still at options. So if you go to think declaratively, you will see that it says if you're coming to Flutter from an imperative framework such as Android or iOS, you need to start thinking about app development from a new perspective. And then they say Flutter is declarative, and this means that Flutter builds its user interface to reflect the current state of your app. And when the state of your app changes, for example, the user flips a switch on the settings screen, you change the state, and that triggers a redraw of the user interface. And we've seen that by using setState. There's no imperative changing of the UI itself, which means you can't go and say, go to that specific widget and just set the text. You change the state, and by changing the state, the UI rebuilds from scratch. And we've seen that with the state full widget, where it rebuilds the nearest build method. And then you can read a bit more about that, and the declarative style of UI programming has many benefits. Remarkably, there's only one code path for any state of the UI. You describe what the UI looked like for any given state once, and that's it. So this is quite nice, and if you want to read a bit more, you can read a bit more about how Flutter actually handles state. So if you want to know more, you can go through this state management and read through all of these that they give you, which will give you a clear indication of how state works in Flutter and how the UI gets redrawn. So if we go then to options there, you will see, and this is quite funny, they say state management is a complex topic. If you feel that some of your questions haven't been answered or that the approach described on these pages is not viable for your use cases, you are probably right. Okay, so there's different state management approaches. They give you a quick general overview, and then they say provider is the recommended approach, recommended by the Flutter team. Now, provider wasn't created by the Flutter team. Provider was created by a person called Remy. So right back in 2018 somewhere, Remy actually created this provider package, and quite nice package to use. So this is the one we will eventually look at in the end of this video. But you will also see setState as one way of handling the state. There's also inherited widget and inherited model. And you can see the setState is a low-level approach to use for widget-specific state. And then this is also a low-level approach used to communicate between ancestors and so forth. And this is, in fact, what the provider package and many other approaches use under the hood. So, for example, provider is making use of inherited widget in order to do what it needs to do. So we'll look at that later on. But you can see setState is one of the options. Then we've got inherited widget and the model. We've got Redux. We've got Fish Redux. We've got Block, Oryx. We've got Gedit. We've got MobX, Flutter commands, Binder, Gedix, and Riverpod. So there's a lot of different state management approaches. And the question then can be, but which one should I use? And that's exactly what they say here. If you find that a specific approach on these pages is not viable for your use case, you are probably right. So luckily, the Flutter developer community is always looking at other ways to handle state. But these packages that we have here, some of them is quite good. And the reason why I'm choosing provider is because it's a recommended approach. So you could have gone with blocks or Redux or whatever. It doesn't matter. You will get your state managed and quite well. So the main question for this video is then, why can we not just use setState? And I'm going to show you now an example of why we cannot just use setState and where we will start running into trouble. So I want you to go to Dartpad. And if you go to, or not to Dartpad, just go to http://bit.ly/state starter. And if you open up that one, you will get to this page. This is a Dartpad. And if you can actually run it from here, but don't run it from here. I want you to go and create a new project folder or a new project, a new Flutter project, and then just add this coding, everything in here. You can just copy and go and paste it inside of Visual Studio Code. Right, so back in Visual Studio Code, you can see I've basically just in my main.dart, I've pasted this coding from that Dartpad. And if you run this, you will see this is the screen that we get. So we get data here at the top, we've got data here, and we've got a button that says change data, but nothing is doing anything at this stage. I've added a few levels into my app here, and you can see it's my app, it's a stateless widget. Then there's main page, which is a stateless widget. There's screen 2, which is a stateless widget. There's screen 3, that's a stateless widget. And there's screen 4, that's a stateless widget. So from the main page, I have a scaffold. I have an app bar that says the text data here, so there you can see it. And then in the body, I open up screen 2. So I'm using the widget called screen 2. It's not a new screen, but it's just another widget. But the widget then opens up and it's got a container that will just contain screen 3. So you can see it's not really anything happening in it. I try to explain a concept here. And then screen 3 is a stateless widget again that opens up screen 4. Screen 4 is a stateless widget again that will just display data here, and that's what we see here. And we can also see a text widget that says change data inside of the elevated button. So it's this one. Now, this is very simple, but just remember that normally when you're creating or extracting widgets like we are doing here, these classes, screen 2, screen 3, screen 4, should actually now be in their own folder, maybe called pages, and we should have, or maybe widgets, maybe have a file called widgets, and we can place all our widgets that we extracted in a separate file, or one widget per file. It's up to you how you want to do that, which means that normally we won't see the following. We won't see a main page in the same file. We will have another screen or another page. We won't see another one and another one again. These will normally be in their own files. So just to demonstrate the concept that I want to bring over, we need to have all of these in the same file. Not that I'm going to declare any global variables to be used in all of them. We will not do that. So we will take it as if they are in their own files. But it's just easier to see if we have everything in one file. So I hope you get the idea. Now let's just have one scenario here. Let's say, for example, the data that's displayed here, that says data here at the top, I also want to have displayed there. I could do that with a global variable, but let's leave out the global variable for now to just demonstrate something here. So for example, if I wanted to have the data that is here, maybe have a variable for it, so I will have a final string, let's call it data, and I will just say John Rambo. As you can see, I like that guy. His bullets never runs out. Okay, so there's string data, John Rambo. And I want to show the data now. Yeah, so that's easy to do. I will just pass in data. And if I save it, I will see, well, John Rambo will be shown at the top. Now, let's say I want to show this exact same data that's at the top, that's declared as John Rambo. I want to also show it all the way down inside of this text widget there. Okay, so at this stage, if I do not declare a global variable, I cannot show the data there because it doesn't pick up the data. That variable is contained inside of this class. So for me to get the data from this class called main page all the way down to screen number 4, and you will see my widget tree now starts with, right at the top, the My App, which contains a material app. Then down the widget tree goes to main page, which is this one. From main page, there's a scaffold, and there's a screen 2 again, which is another widget. From screen 2, the widget tree goes down to screen 3. From screen 3, the widget tree goes down again to screen number 4. And so it traverses down the tree. So in order for me to actually get the data that we have inside of this class called main page. And remember now, imagine these are all in different files. Okay, so to get the data from this class, main page, all the way down to screen number 4, I will need to pass it down the line, which means I will need to go to screen 2, and I can declare that final variable there again. Let's say string data again, just keep it the same name. I will use it in the constructor as a required argument, and it will be this.data. Okay, so what I can do then is use that data that we just declared in the constructor and pass in data, which is John Rambo. So now that data gets passed to screen 2. Now in screen 2, we've got access to it. But now you can see that we need to pass it again to screen number 3. So I'm going to do the same thing again. I will have final string data, exactly the same thing again. Let's have this required, and we'll say this.data. And now in screen 3 there, I can also just pass the data. Okay, so now we've passed the data from there, John Rambo, to this text widget, that one there, but we've passed it through to screen 2. Screen 2 passed it through to screen 3. Now screen 3 also needs to pass it through to screen 4. So I can say final string data. Now let's go to the constructor there and just use the required keyword there again, this.data. And for screen 3 or 4, I can then also pass through the data from screen 3. And now, at long last, we have it in screen 4, and I can then have data displayed there. And now you can see John Rambo and John Rambo. Now to send through the data between different branches of your tree, going all the way down until it gets to where you actually want to display it, feels very, very repetitive. And the main thing that we can see here is that screen 2 actually has nothing to do with this data. Screen 3 has nothing to do with the data. It's just passing it through. So it works like a middleman sending through data. So this is actually defeating the single responsibility principle, because screen 2 has got nothing to do with this data being passed through. Even screen 3 has got nothing to do with the data that gets passed through. It's just acting like a middleman. Okay, now let's look at something else. Let's say that by clicking this button, now if you look at the button, it's the elevated button right down at screen number 4. And let's say in this on press now, I want to actually change the data of this John Rambo to something else, which means I will need to go back to this variable to change its state. How on earth will we be able to do that? Okay, so let me show you this. This is also possible. So I can call setState here. Try calling setState won't work. And why is that? Because we are using a stateless widget. So I'm just going to use control dot there, and I'm going to convert this to a stateful widget. And now you can see the data is in the top screen, so referring to it as widget.data. So now I'm able to call setState. So I can call setState in here, but what on earth will I be passing in here? What will I be setting the state to? Because I can't set it to that data variable. I mean, I can go to widget.data, and I can try and set it to something, let's say, and you can see that's not allowed. So we can't do that. That data that's been passed through, I can't set the value to that data. It's impossible. And also, how is it going to traverse back up the tree in order to get to the part where I actually need to update it so that my abars text will also update if I click on change data. So if I click on change data, John Rambo must update as well as John Rambo there at the top. It must be the same value. So how on earth will we do that? Okay, so for now, I'm going to remove the setState here. And what we need to do, or what we can do, it's not the best way of doing this, but what we can do is to make this one at the top also a stateful widget. And then this stateful widget at the top, we will have a method here, or a function. So we're going to call this function void change value. And what we want to do is to pass in a string data, or let's say data changed. And then what we want to do is call setState. And I can call setState because I'm inside of a stateful widget. I can then call setState, and whatever this data variable that was passed through, we can set our data to this data changed. And you can already see that we're going to get a problem here because this was declared as final. So we cannot have that one as final anymore. Okay, so it's going to be variable. We're going to change it. So we can call this function, change value, pass in data changed, which will be the new value that we want to be displayed there, and then set this data now to that data changed. So now the question is, how on earth do I call this function? So at the end, we will actually need to send through this function so that at the end, screen number 4 can use that function so we can send back the data to the top. Okay, so let's see how we can do that. So we need to send it to screen number 2 first, then to screen 3, and then to screen 4. So we need to traverse the tree exactly the same way as we did with this data variable. Okay, so what we need to do is to go to the constructor of screen number 2, and we'll have a final function that can accept a string value, and let's call it, so this one we called change value. Let's just call this one change data. Okay, so it's a function called change data that will be able to accept a string, because that's exactly what we have here. It's a function called change, well, in this case, change value, but the name doesn't matter. Change data, but the function's type must be able to accept a string. So that's exactly this function that we are basically declaring there. And then we can go into the constructor and we can pass through that function. So it's going to be this dot change data. And you can see everything's fine. And now in screen 2, where we've got that change data, we just need to pass in a function that will be able to accept a string value. Okay, so it's exactly that one. And we just indicate the name, change value. Okay, so that's how we pass it through. So now I'm passing through this method or this function into that property called change data, and now we have it. So now here we can actually change that data now, and it will call setState, and it will change it or update it. And this we call a callback. So I'm passing through a function, and then when it's used this side, it's creating a callback back to this one. Okay. So let's go down. Now screen 2 has got it. But again, we can see that screen 2 has got nothing to do with this data. And already we've passed through 2 pieces of data that it actually need to know nothing of. It's just being a middleman to actually distribute this data. Not good at all. Okay, so let's go to this one and do the same. So it's again going to be a function that accepts a string. And we're going to call it, let's call it change data also. And again, as part of the constructor, we will have required this dot change data. So now we can also pass it through to screen number 3. So that change data, we will pass through change data. Okay, so now that function change data is in screen 3, but we need to get it to screen 4. Same process again. Final function that can accept a string called change data. Now, we could have called it something different for every class, but let's keep it the same. So I'll have required there, and it will be this dot change data. Okay, so now, by passing it to screen 4, change data, and also using change data there, we now have access to the function right here inside of this stateful widget. And we probably can change it back to stateless widget again. So now we've got this function inside of screen 4, and it's called change data. So what we can do then inside of this onPressed will be just going to change data. Now in order to access that, you'll need to go to widget.change data, and we can just pass in to that function that string value. So let's say we want to change it now to Chuck Norris, another nice guy whose bullets never run out. Okay, so it's widget.changeData. I'm using that function now, and I'm passing in Chuck Norris. So what will happen? It will go up, 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 up again, call this function, set that data to data changed, and because we're calling setState, it will rebuild the UI. Okay, so let's see if that actually works. So let's run this again. Now you can see it's John Rambo. As soon as I click change data there, you can see Chuck Norris, Chuck Norris. So that actually worked now. But again, can you see what's happening now? Let me just see if I can change this one back to a state list widget, but it's not necessary. We can leave it as it is. Okay, so if I click there now, that Chuck Norris has been sent up the tree again, right to the top. And by calling setState, what actually happens now? Because we're calling setState, inside of this main page state, that setState will actually rebuild from here. And we can see this. You can see that I've got print statements there. There's a print statement, building main page. There's building screen 2. There's a print statement, building screen 3. There's a print statement, building screen 4. Okay, so let's look at that. I'm going to rerun this quickly. So I'm going to rerun this. Now look at what happens. Right from the start, it builds the main page, screen 2, screen 3, and screen 4. Okay, and that's understandable. Now look at what happens if I click this button. As soon as I click the button, it rebuilds every single one of those pages again. And the scary thing here is screen 2 and screen 3 should not be rebuilt at all because they know nothing about that data variable that we send through and that we update right at the top. It knows nothing of it. I mean, screen 2 does nothing with it except for just sending it through to the next one. Screen 3 knows nothing about it. It just sends through. Now, these are very small examples, but imagine now screen 2 is a very big layout of its own page of 100, 200 lines of coding with a lot of widgets in it. And the same for screen 3. What happens if I send through the data? I just want to send through the data to screen 4, but it needs to go through screen 2 and screen 3 in order to get to that one. And every time that happens, by just clicking a simple button, I'm rebuilding, in fact, my whole user interface. And you can see there, I'm rebuilding main page, screen 2, screen 3, and screen 4 by just clicking that one button. So yes, you can see that this is totally doable by using only setState. And as we've seen on that webpage, setState is one of the state management solutions. So yes, it can work, but you can see we've got a lot of boilerplate code going through, and you can see if you start building a really big application, this will really get you into trouble. Okay, so this is one way of doing it, and you can see that we went up until 112 lines of coding by sending through data. And lines of coding doesn't matter, so don't get me wrong there. But we are adding a lot of boilerplate code, and the main thing here is screen 2 and screen 3 knows absolutely nothing or should not know anything about the data that I'm passing through or sending back to update. But it does at this stage. And also screen 2 and screen 3, because of that, gets rebuilt, which we do not want. And that could affect the performance of your app. Right, so what I'm going to do now, I'm going to leave my main.dot there, and I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call this one main2.dot. And I'm going to paste that same coding again. There's the same data again. You can see it's the same as we had previously. And now what I'm going to do is to see if we cannot do this in another way that actually makes a little bit more sense and is a lot easier to maintain. And at the same time, make sure that screen 2 and screen 3 will know nothing about that data. So we actually want them to stay exactly as they are without adding any coding to them. Right, so now going back to this web page, you will see that there's provider, and this is the recommended approach. And you can just right-click there to open up the link in a new tab for the provider package. And you can see it opens up pub.dev with provider 5.0.0. And you'll see it's published on March the 4th, 2021. And if you look at versions also for this, you can see that this thing started way back in October 19, 2018. So this provider package has been updated a lot to make better and better and better. Another way to get to this in the future, just go to pub.dev and search the package for provider. So that's also an easy way to get to it. And this first one, provider 500, it's the newest one currently at the time of this video. So if you click on provider, you can go to installing, and you will use this line there, provider 500. So we're going to copy that, and we're going to use it inside of our pubspec.yaml. So as part of your packages, just underneath your Cupertino icons, we're going to paste provider. And I'm going to save, and that will include this provider package for me. Now, I'm going to stop this from running because currently we are running main2 or main.dot. So we want to run main2.dot. Now, because we've added a new package in the pubspec.yaml, whether we were running whichever one, doesn't matter. It's better to stop it and then rerun again because we included a new package. Okay. Now let's go to main2.dot. So I'm going to run this one. So by just right-clicking and saying run without debugging, we will now be running main2.dot. Right. So now you can see it's running, and just make sure that at the bottom now you can see I'm launching main2.dot. So if I make changes, it's the changes on main2.dot. Okay, so let's go down and let's see how we can include the provider package now, or how we can use the provider package to actually help us. So what we want to do is to go and identify where in the tree do we have the data that I want to set. So in this case, the data here is where I want to go and change data, as well as there on these two text widgets. Okay, so in order for this provider package to actually help us, we can go and create our own model class. So for example, I'm just going to call this app data because they're just a simple string value that we're passing through. And what you need to include is with change notifier. Now, if you use that change notifier at the top, okay, it's part of the material package. So for that change notifier, or for this class app data, it says with change notifier. So it's a mix-in basically that helps me to notify of any changes that happens inside of any instance of this class. And we'll look at that concept now. So the provider class will need some model classes that you are going to work with that uses the mix-in called change notifier. So change notifier, like the name says, it will notify of any changes inside of the instance of this class. Okay, so inside of this class, I will now declare the data that I want to change. So instead of me having to go and declare final, maybe here, final string equals John Rambo there at the top, I will do it right here. So I'm going to say string, and I can even name it with an underscore, which means I can make it private there. So I'm going to say string name equals, and let's have John Rambo there. And then all I need to do, if I want to change it, I want to go and call a method or a function. So I'm going to call this one void change data, and I want to accept some data. And that data will then be set to this name. So I will basically go and say, go to name and set it to this new data that was passed in. But now an important thing that's a bit different here is we need to call notify listeners. So you'll see now what we will do inside of our widget tree. We will mark the values that needs to change. So for example, I will mark this one as something that needs to listen for updates on that class. I will also go and mark this one to listen to updates from that class called updater or app data. So as soon as data inside of this class is changing, for example, if name gets a new data, then we notify all the listeners, and those listeners know that it needs to update the value and to rebuild the user interface. Okay. Now, also another way or another thing that we should add here is to get back this name. So obviously, if you do not name it private there, you can just call it by saying going to the object, dot the name, and you get the name, or you can set the name as the same by just using an equal sign. But if you want to have it private like I have it now, I will need to create a getter for it. So the getter, let's call it the same, but just not with the underscore, and that will return back this name for me. Okay, so the getter method or the getter function there will return back the name called John Rambo at this stage. Okay, and that's all we need for this model class. And now normally you would put this class maybe under a folder called models and add this class in its own file called appdata.dot or something like that. I'm just going to keep it inside of this file so that we see it and it's easy to work with. Right, so now the idea is that I need to go somewhere in my widget tree and use a change notifier. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go into my scaffold. I'm going to use the control dot, and I'm going to wrap it with a widget called change notifier provider. Now, if you hover over this change notifier provider, you can see it's got, or it wants to have this create. There's a parameter called create, so we will set that now. So you can see there's create, there's a child, and there's a builder. So I'll show you now. It's going to give us an error by just using child. But in some cases, or in most cases, you can actually just use the child as it is now. But in our case, because it is really too close to the parent, which is the scaffold, it's going to give us an error. Okay, so for this change notifier, we will need to use the create there. And for the create, leave your cursor there and use the fat arrow, because this will just be returning an instance now of the class that we want to use. So this is the model class we want to use that's got the change notifier mixin, and it's called app data. So what I want to do then here is to go and just call this app data, and basically just creating a new instance of that class. So it's an object now called app data, and that is the one it needs to listen for updates. So this change notifier provider will allow widgets now underneath it to get marked to listen for changes inside of app data. So if we save this now, you will see that nothing really happens because we haven't marked this one to change. So let's see how we can mark this text widget now to show the data that is contained in that app data class. So it's the data here, this name, John Rambo, we want to show now inside of this text widget. So all I need to do is to go into this part and use the provider class .of. And just before the of and the bracket, you'll need to display the type or to show the type there. So this will be of type app data. So it's the same class that we created at the bottom. It's the same type. I want to listen for changes inside of that class. And then after the context, if you put the dot, you can see we've got access now. And yes, we've got access to the underscore name, because even though it's private there, remember it's private inside of this file. So if you have this in your own class, you won't be able to use that dot and use the underscore name. Okay, so do not use that one. So name is that getter that we created. So this getter there at the bottom, just calling name, will return back that name for me. Okay, so now we basically marked this text widget to listen for changes on that name variable. So it gets marked, and as soon as something changes in that name variable, it will update this text widget. Now, if we run this now, let's run it quickly and see what we get. Okay, we get a nice error. And this is the nice thing about this Remy guy. Just look at the details of this error. And it tells you basically this happens because you used the build context. It does not include the provider of your choice. There are a few common scenarios. You added a provider in your main.dart and performed a hot reload. The provider you're trying to read is in a different route, or you use the build context that is an ancestor of the provider you're trying to read. So this is basically what we did now, is we had this one too close, marked this one too close to actually the scaffold, which is the child now of the child notifier provider. So in order to overcome this, and this is the recommended approach also, I will recommend doing this, is to not use the child like we did now here. So the scaffold is the child, but instead of using the child, I'm going to use a builder there. So for the builder, just hover there and leave your cursor there and choose this one that says context child with the brackets. Okay, and all we need to do then is, instead of using this child property here, so I'm going to copy that whole part there, I will return it in here. So I'm going to say return scaffold and just end it off with a semicolon. Okay, and then this part for the child we can totally remove now. So I'm going to remove that and save again. So this is the structure. You will have your change notifier provider at the top. It must have create and then also use builder. So that's just the recommended part. Otherwise, you could run into that same type of error that I just had. So rather use builder than using child. So instead of using child, we use builder and we return that child. So the value for the child, we will just be returning. So we will be returning a scaffold with an app bar, and this one there will be listening for changes. And you can see John Rambo is now there. So I have that data there by saying provider of app data, go and listen to app data. And if app data's name changes, I want to have it updated here. So in this case, it didn't change, but right from the start when we ran it, we've got that value now directly from that class, and that's the default value. So John Rambo is what we had there, John Rambo. So that's what it's displaying right from the start. Now, another thing that's very important here, the second argument is part of this context. There's also a listen. Now, this listen has got a default value of true, which means that if you have a widget in your widget tree that needs to listen, you can just leave it as it is. You don't need to change the listen to true because that's the default. So just leaving it like this is the default. Listen is true. So which means it needs to listen. Does it need to listen? Yes or no? Yes, it needs to listen for any changes inside of app data, in specific that name variable. So if you go down, you can see it's a change notifier. It's the mixin called change notifier. So as soon as this data gets changed, it will notify the listeners, and this one will listen for it. So that's why we need to have this listen as set to true. But that is also the default value there. So you don't need to set it if you know you're going to listen for true. Or you're going to listen, so you don't need to set it to true. You can just leave it as a default there. Okay, so now you can see John Rambo is showing there at the top. So how will we then show it also there at the bottom? Well, it's exactly the same way. So I'm going to copy that one again, and let's go to the bottom where we've got data here, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing. I'm just going to say provider of app data, again context and name, and save. And there we see John Rambo. Can you see that I did not pass through any values from main page to screen 2, to screen 3, to screen 4? I'm just using provider with the data it needs to listen to, and then it will show it for me. Okay, again, listen is set to true here. Let's look at something else, because now we are just basically listening for changes and we're getting that value back, and we have it on the widget. But now, how can we use this change data? So the place where we change data is in screen number 4. And now, let me just quickly handle this also. You can see that I've got this text widget here, but I don't have a change notifier provider in here, which means that this change notifier provider works for everything in the same widget tree going down. So everywhere underneath this, we can mark it for that same data type, app data, and it will listen for it. Okay, so what the creator of the package then also recommend is that you go as high up as needed. Don't go higher up than what's needed. For example, I could have placed it above this material app, but it won't make sense because I'm only using it in this scaffold. So then I will place it right above the scaffold and start using it from there. So don't overscope it. And now everywhere from here on down the tree, I will have access to this app data, and I can look at the changes. That's what that was made. Right, so going down, that's why we can use it here, because screen 4, how do we get to screen 4? We go to the scaffold, then we open up screen 2. Screen 2 opens up screen 3. Screen 3 opens up screen 4, and screen 4 is where we have it. So it's down the tree, so it's working fine. Okay, so let's see in this on press now. If we click this button, we want to actually now change that. So now it's easy again. I'm still going to use provider again, .of. Again, I'm going to indicate the type where I want to change, and that's app data. And now as part of this, I will use the dot again, and you will see there's my change data. So that change data function there is this change data function I have there. So I'm just going to provider, same as we did here, provider.of, app data again, the type, context again. Instead of referring to the variable, I'm referring to a function now, and it's called change data. And all I need to do is change the data here now. So if I change the data now, let's say let's go with Chuck Norris, and I save it now, what will happen now? As soon as I call change data and I pass through Chuck Norris, what will happen? Chuck Norris will now be set to this name variable, and we will call notify listeners. So where is it going to notify? Everywhere we've got that listen property. So I'll have it there, and I'll have it there. So those two will then update. So let's see if we run this now, what we will get. I'm going to run this again. Now let's look at what happens when I click this button. Click the button. We've got a nice little error again. And the error that we've got here, let's quickly explain this error. For widgets, the value that we need to have here is listen true. And that's the default. So you don't need to set it like I'm doing it now. And the same here. If I go there, next to that context, I'm actually using listen true. Okay, so if I go down, this part here is not part of the tree. So the elevated buttons function is not part of the widget tree. And if you are calling the provider of with app data and the context, and you are not part of the widget tree, then you must go and remember to set listen to false. So if listen is not false, it will also actually try and listen, but there's no widget it needs to update. Okay, so make sure you set it to false then. And if we run this again, you'll see John Rambo there. If I click on change data, I can see Chuck Norris at the top. Okay, so you can see everything working as expected now. So very important. When should you use true and when should you use false? If you have a widget where you need to listen for the data, then listen must be true. If you're going to use it in a function where you want to only get back the value and not actually set the state, then you're going to set listen to false. So for example, instead of saying .change data there, I could have just gotten that value, name. But I don't need to listen to it. So let's say we just wanted to print out this value. So I can print out that value of name, where we've got now, save it. So let's go to the bottom. If I click this now, you can just see it prints out the value. So whether you're calling a method or just getting back the data for whatever reason, you will set listen to false because it doesn't need to update any widget now. So just make sure of that. So in our case, we will not print out anything, but we actually want to change the data. So I want to call that function. So I'm going to call the function called change data, and we're going to set the data to Chuck Norris. Okay, so let's save that again. Let's change it to something else. Peter Norris or Morris. Okay, that's fine. Okay, so if we change it now, if I click on change data, you can see Peter Morris changed everywhere. Now, look at this again. Very interesting. Right at the top, we've got this change notifier provider that creates an instance of this class. And we've got the builder that returns back basically the rest of the widget tree. I've marked this text widget as something that needs to change by using provider of, specifying the data type there, and it needs to listen, and we're going to listen for that name variable. If it changes, it will change this. Okay, why does it change? Because we've got this method called change data that will notify the listeners. So this line here is basically just adding a listener for this text widget and will apply that value as soon as it changes. Now, if we go down again, the same thing happened here. We're marking this text widget to listen. So you can see listen is true, although that's the default, so you don't need to have it. Okay, so it's listening, and as soon as that value gets changed and it gets called notify listeners, it will also update the value here. Now, as of the release, I'm not sure when, it's some of the newest releases now of the provider package. There's actually a new way to do this. I'm just going to show you this quickly. Instead of having this whole thing, we can actually just go and say context dot. And there's two functions that you can use. You can either use watch or you can use read. So let's use watch here. So I'm going to say context dot watch. The type I need to watch for is again app data, and I want to watch which value? Name. Okay, so you can see it's a lot shorter than using provider.of and so forth. So this one does exactly the same thing. So it's just a shorter way of doing this, and it's the recommended way. So you can just say context.watch app data and then go and refer to whatever you want to use. Now, this watch one, let me just copy this one. I'm going to copy it and I'm going to use it at the bottom. So at the bottom there, instead of using this whole thing, we will be using only watch. And if we run this again, let's change this to John. Well, let's add my name there. And I'm going to save it again. So when I click on it, it's still changing. Everything still works the same. So it's a shorthand way of doing exactly the same thing. So very important, this watch function sets that listen to true. So you cannot use watch here. So in this case, if you wanted to do or replace this with a shorthand, you're going to use context.read. So the read function will set that listen property to false. Okay, so if I save that, so that's the difference between the two. You're either going to use watch or you're going to use read. Watch inside of a tree, inside of a widget, and read wherever you're outside of the widget tree and it doesn't need to listen for changes. Then you're going to use read. So it's just reading the data and calling the method or the function there, or reading and just calling that value. Okay, and that's the shorthand route to do exactly the same thing. So I don't want to rerun this every time, so let's make this Chuck Norris again and save it. So if I click now, I should see the change there. Okay, so we've got an error. It's because we need to specify the type here. Okay, so it's going to be app data. Let's save it again. Okay, let's just rerun this one quickly. Okay, we're back at John Rambo. Clicking it, back to Chuck Norris. Okay, so now everything is working as expected. And again, the only thing we did was to create a model class called appData that uses the mixin called change notifier. If there's a change, it will notify all the listeners that's listening to this appData. And we do that by supplying a change notifier at the top. In the create, we basically point it to that class that we want to listen. And we have the builder that returns the rest of the widget tree wherever we want to mark something to listen. So this is how I mark it to listen for a specific value. So this one listens for name. And then also the one at the bottom, this one listens for name as well. And as soon as we call this function by just going to context.read appData change data, as soon as I pass through that value, it will set the new value and it will notify the listeners. All those that listened, which is this one, will refresh the UI. And if we go up, that one will also refresh the UI. Right, all well. Now let's look at this print statement. So you can see we've got a print statement there, building the main page, building the screen 2, building screen 3, building screen 4. So let's rerun this again. Okay, so I've run this afresh now. So let's look at the bottom. You can see it prints out the main page was built, screen 2, screen 3, and screen 4 was built. Now let's see what happens when I actually refresh. Which ones do I want to refresh? I'm refreshing a widget in screen 4, and I'm refreshing a widget in the main page. So let's see what happens if I click this button now. Okay, I clicked it now more than once. But you can see main page, screen 2, screen 4, that was initially when it runs, and that you can do nothing about. You need that. So when I click the button, it actually builds screen 2, 3, and 4 again. When I click the button again, it rebuilds screen 2, 3, and 4 again. And you can see every time I click it, it's actually rebuilding the whole widget tree from 2, 3, and 4. Okay, so what happens is still not very good. So the only thing that we have managed to not have rebuilt the whole time from our previous one where we just used setState is in fact just the main page that's not rebuilding. But screen 2, 3, and 4 is still rebuilding. Again, 2, 3, and 4. Every time I click that button, screen 2, 3, and 4 is rebuilding. And that we do not want. So even though now we have separated the business logic in a separate class, because now it is, let me go back to main 2, the business logic is now basically in this appData class. So the logic of that name being passed through and so forth is somewhere else. We've separated the business logic, but it's still not rebuilding as we want. So for example, screen 2 and screen 3 knows nothing about Chuck Norris there that needs to change. And you can see it's got nothing in it. So yes, we've won because we are now using the single responsibility principle correctly. So now let's see how we can repair this part so that we actually just rebuild what we need. Okay, so in order to do this, we're going to do the following. So inside of my text widget, this text widget, I want to replace now with something else. So what I'm going to do basically now for the next part of the video is we're going to mark this text widget to be the only thing that we need to update, which means this whole build method should not run. We should only update and rebuild this text widget. And the same at the bottom. We don't want this whole build method or function to run. We want to only rebuild this text widget. So let's see how we can do that. So if you want to do that, which I recommend you do, is just going and control dot on the text widget, wrap it with a widget, and you're going to wrap it with a consumer. So I'm basically now marking this text widget as something that needs to rebuild, and only that needs to be rebuilt. Okay, so if you hover over this consumer, you can see it's got a builder widget and a child. So again, like we did with this notifier, this change notifier, we will rather be using the builder there. Okay, so let's keep the child there so we can refer to it back now and to copy it from there. But we will use the builder. So I'm going to use the builder there. Keep your cursor there. And then we're going to use this one, context value child. Now, very important, you need to set the type of this consumer. So the type is again that app data of ours. Now, instead of having this whole text widget there, I'm going to cut it from there and remove the child property totally. And inside the builder, I will just return that text widget. Okay. Now, because we have, if you have a look at this value now, that's inside of the builder, that value is in fact the app data now. So now we don't need this part anymore because we've got that value in value. Okay, so we've got value.name. And now that's all we need to do. Okay, so let's do the same thing now for the bottom text. So I'm going to actually take this whole consumer there because it's going to look the same. Okay, so let's go down, and where we have this text widget, I will also replace it with that same consumer. So it's a consumer class using a specific data type, which is app data. It will have a builder to build your user interface for that specific part, and it will be returning a text widget, which will have the value, which is app data, and the name. So this consumer class helps us to only identify one single part of your user interface that needs to listen and needs to rebuild. Okay, so let's save this now and rerun and see how this changes. Okay, so it's that same print functions again, and you can see it prints out main page, screen 2, screen 3, screen 4. So now when we click on it, it should change to Chuck Norris now. So let's see if that changes. Chuck Norris. And I can keep on clicking that button, and you can see nothing gets rebuilt. And this is, if you want performance, this is how you can really boost your performance. Okay, so at this stage, Chuck Norris clicking that button, changing the value, does not rebuild anything. So what does this mean? It will basically just rebuild this part, and that's just the text widget. It won't run this whole build method. And also here, it's only rebuilding this part. So it's only the text widget, whatever you return. Okay, and that is it for how your provider can help you to manage the state. And you can see, if you look at this one now, maybe it's a bit more complex than the one that we had here, because it's sending through, this one sent through the functions and the data in order to set the state at the top. So maybe this one is a bit easier to understand, but main2 is way more, or main2.dart, this one is way more efficient. And why am I saying that? Because by using this model class at the bottom, we are separating the business logic. And remember, app data can now go in its own class. So it's totally outside of main2.dart. We're separating the business logic. Also, another thing that's very important is that screen 2 and screen 3 that knows nothing about that data being sent through actually at this stage doesn't have anything. And the nice thing now also, have a look at this. This is a stateless widget. Stateless, 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 stateless. I do not have even one stateful widget, which means boilerplate code is something of the past. Okay. Now, very important, single responsibility principle. This screen 2 has got its own responsibility to do something. This screen 3 has got its own responsibility to do something. And it has nothing to do with this app data at all now. Whereas previously in the main.dart, you've seen that screen 2 had nothing to do with data or this function, but it needs to have it in order to pass it through the widget tree. And the same for screen 3. It has nothing to do with any one of these data that's been passed through, but it needs to go through in order to reach screen 4. And you can see this one, yes, we could have left a stateless widget. That one is left a stateless widget. But this one at the bottom, we can probably also make a stateless widget. But the one at the top where we need to set the state, yeah, it needs to be a stateful widget. Otherwise, we cannot call setState. Okay, so I hope you've learned something from this video. And the next video that we will look at will be going into maybe a bigger example where you will also see how using just setState will really complicate things. So I hope that you understand the concept of the provider package, and remember you can go and read the documentation for the provider package. There's a lot more. We also will go into futures a bit later, and also how to handle routes with the provider package. But that is still to come. Thank you very much for watching this video. See you in the next one.